this morning. I'd like to introduce Kathleen Biggins. She is the founder and president of Sea Change Conversations. It's a national nonprofit dedicated to fostering understanding about the risks associated with climate change. She created Sea Change in 2014, and this was not something she ever intended to do. She has a background in journalism and advertising. Since she created Sea Change, the organization has reached more than 17,000 people. And she first reached me when I visited DC for a legislative conference back in 2020, and I heard her speak, and she inspired me so much that I came back to Athens and created an Athens chapter of Sea Change. So our chapter is also devoted to spreading the word about climate change in a way that avoids all of the silly partisan bickering that's gotten in the way of science. Kathleen hails from New Orleans, and she loves the South. She graduated from the University of Virginia, attended the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg in Germany as a Rotary Scholar, and had a career in journalism and advertising. She now lives in Princeton with her husband and her dog. Yes. Thank you so much for being at UGA.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to the incredible team right here in Athens who's doing such important work. It is really such an honor with you to be here with you. And we're hoping that we're going to have visuals to share with you. But I have faith, and it looks like it's coming, so that's great. So why do you want to be a journalist? Is it because you're a good writer or a good photographer and you want to share experiences with the greater world? Is it because you want to shine an investigated light on something that you see as a wrong or an ill so that society can know about it and maybe address it? Or are you someone who likes to interpret things and put it within context of history or politics or even social science? Whatever the reason is that you are interested in a career for journalism, buckle up, because you guys are on the front row seat of one of the biggest revolutions that human civilization has ever experienced. This move to clean tech, this move to pivot away from the risk of climate change is projected to be bigger than the Industrial Revolution when we moved from farming into manufacturing, and the digital revolution where we moved to electronics and computers. And why? Because it's going to impact almost every area of our life: how we build our houses, where we live, what we eat, and how we work. So let's take a deep dive into this issue of climate change and understand why it is posing such a risk and why civilization is making such a hard turn to mitigate its impacts. So what is climate change? Climate change is really just the changing of our long-term weather patterns: our heat, our cold, our rain, our snow, even our wind currents and our water currents. And why is it happening? Because we are changing the composition of our atmosphere by putting up more greenhouse gases. The feedback is, we're getting a little feedback here. Can we fix? Okay, sorry, I don't want to blow your eardrums out. Our heat, our cold, and why is it happening? Because we are changing the composition of our atmosphere by changing the levels of greenhouse gases. And we're doing that primarily by burning fossil fuels, but also through our land use practices. So we're going to focus in on this challenge in three ways. One, how do we know it's really happening? Two, what are the potential consequences? And three, what is the hope? What are the opportunities? How expensive or difficult would it be to avoid that risk? So let's jump into that first one. How likely is it to happen? Well, we know it's more than likely. We know indeed it is happening. And the way we know that is because we understand the basic science of how greenhouse gases work. It has been well understood for over 150 years, and it's non-controversial. The second part, as I said, we're going to talk about the consequences. And then that third part, about how difficult it is to avoid. So let's look at how greenhouse gases work. And for that, we're going to jump back to your 6th grade class. Tell me if you remember this. The solar radiance comes down, it passes through the atmosphere and strikes the Earth's surface. Much of that energy is absorbed, but quite a lot of it ricochets back out into space. And when it does so, it is at a new wavelength. And this new wavelength is partially captured by a teeny tiny portion of our atmosphere, less than 1%, that is made up of greenhouse gases, which is carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and even water vapor. Without this teeny tiny portion of our atmosphere being comprised of these greenhouse gases, we would have a frozen planet. So they play an outsized role in modulating our climate. But when we add to them, it simply means that they capture more of that ricocheting energy, re-radiating more of it back down to the surface, heating us up and adding energy into our climate systems. Another way to know that it's happening is to understand the balance of carbon. Now, we all know there's a balance between plants and animals, but what we may not know is there's also a balance between where nature stores carbon, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and in the earth. And I'd like to call your attention to these 2 words, fossil fuels, because I think if we consider what they are, we can understand what's happening. So fossil fuels are little bits of plant and animal matter that fell to the earth millions of years ago, got silted over, and with time, heat, and pressure, got turned back into pools of elemental carbon, what we call natural gas, coal, and oil. And humans came along and said, wow, really rich in energy, really portable, really storable, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it to run my vehicles, to heat my homes, to power my factories, and to create these vibrant economies that we have all benefited from. But in doing so, humans were taking carbon dioxide that nature had sequestered deep underground and started pumping it up into the atmosphere at the alarmingly fast rate of 40 million tons of carbon every single year. Much faster than it happens in nature, and upsetting the balance that has existed really since humankind has flourished. And since we know adding those greenhouse gases will increase the temperature, it's no surprise that all of the major institutions of the world say that we have raised the temperature about 1.1 degrees Celsius, which correlates to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, 2 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't sound like a big deal, right? It seems like a small number, but in fact, it's a huge deal when we talk about average global temperature, and makes for big changes for those of us who are living on the surface during this period. So we're going to get more into this as we go into the presentation, but don't let those small numbers fool you. Another way that we know it's happening is we can see it with our own eyes. This is a graphic from NOAA that shows how the ice in the Arctic Ocean is melting and leaching away. So what we're looking at is from about 1990 up towards more current time. The mature ice is depicted in white, and it is being replaced by immature ice in open water, which is depicted in light blue and dark blue. And the reason why this is so important is that mature ice is highly reflective. So that means more of that initial solar radiance that comes down ricochets back out into space. When we melt it or lose it, it means that the Earth will absorb more of that initial energy, and we are warming up the Earth for future generations. Another way that we know it's happening is that we can literally measure which of the carbon molecules in the air come from burning fossil fuels, which only humankind does. So which part of the carbon and greenhouse gases up there did we cause? And we can do that because they have a different atomic fingerprint, if you will. They have a different isotope that enables us to identify them. And we know we put up about 660 billion metric tons since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is about 50% more than existed at that time. Another way that we know it's happening is that we have a way to look back through history to see how today is different than yesteryear. And we do this through a discipline called paleoclimatology. Scientists like this one use proxies, things like tree rings and coral reefs, but also ice cores. And these ice cores can be 800,000 years old. And a scientist like this one is looking for little air pockets that was trapped eons ago when the snow fell and melted over. And they can liberate those little pockets of air and discern what the carbon levels were going back 800,000 years in the past. And what do they show us? They show us that we are in uncharted territory, that for the last 800,000 years, our CO2 levels have bandied from about 150 to about 300 parts per million. These were through the ice age and thaw, the natural cycles the Earth has always gone through. But then in 1910, we crossed out of those natural cycles. Today, we are close to 420 parts per million, and scientists say if we were to continue on this current emissions path, we would hit close to 1,000 parts per million at the end of this century. So hopefully you're with me that we know climate change is happening. Let's move to that second part of our assessment, which is how dangerous is it? What are the potential consequences that we could be facing? And to do that, I need to really kind of spend a minute to orient you on this slide. So on the bottom, we have time, coming from today all the way back to about 20,000 years ago. And on the y-axis, we have temperature from 8 or 9 degrees colder to about 11 degrees hotter. The gold line is average global temperature, and the whites are kind of milestones so that we have reference points. So 20,000 years ago, we were in a glacial period of the Ice Age, and we had a mile of ice over Manhattan and much of the northern parts of our country, and a lot of the planet was totally uninhabitable. And then over about, say, 8,000 years, why did you move? Anyway, 8,000, it's like magic. 8,000 years, nature moderated, coming up to what more or less has been the average global temperature for the last 10,000 years when our species has really flourished. And that temperature is right around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So 60 degrees Fahrenheit is a really good temperature for our species and for human productivity and for many, or almost most, of the species that have evolved to live with us on the planet during this period. But it is not a temperature the Earth has been at very often in its long history. It is not the default choice that the Earth wants to revert back to if we knock it off that temperature. And then you see when we hit 60 degrees, we settled down. We started to farm, we started to create civilizations. This little hill was probably a degree warmer when the Vikings could grow vegetables in icy Greenland. This divot, perhaps 2 degrees, was the Ice Age. When the glaciers came down, there was great crop failures, upheaval, war, again showing how a small temperature change can lead to a real change on how people experience life during that period. And then you see the temperature going up and away, landing somewhere between 3.6 and 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter by the end of this century, with the most likely level being somewhere around 5 to 7 to 7.4. So let's think about that. Nature had 8,000 years to do that delta, right? To literally march trees from Mexico to Montana to create the ecosystems and the biodiversity that have supported all of us for the last 10,000 years. And now, through our actions, we are potentially triggering that same delta in the next 100 years. And that's scary, right? And that is what pulled all of the nations of the world together, 196 countries, to say, we can't go there. We can't go to those high numbers because we aren't so sure we'll be able to handle what nature might throw at us. We need to keep it at that 3.6 level, which correlates to a 2 degrees Celsius number we see in the press, or even better at a 1.5 degrees Celsius level. Now let's drill down on what these changes are that we are precipitating through climate change. But as we do so, I'd like you to consider them through 3 specific lenses. The first one is how will it impact jobs and economy? The second is how will it impact your and your family's health and personal security? And the third is how will it impact your exposure to geopolitical instability, which we kind of experience as refugee flows, civil chaos, and even terrorism. Does anyone in the audience want to guess why I'm asking you to look through these specific lenses? Any brave soul? Come on. I guess. Yes.
These are beats covered by journalists, so it's already been conducted.
These are covered by journals. That's true. That's a good answer. And these are also the three things that Americans say are most important to them when they go to vote. And we believe that climate change will negatively impact all three. So let's see if you will agree. Let's start with heat. After all, it's called global warming. This is a graphic from NASA. It shows how average global temperature has changed from pre-industrial time to today. When it is blue, it's colder than average. When it is white, it is average, yellow, warmer, and red, hotter. So as you can see at the end, the red really kind of comes crescendoing in because we're shattering records at this point. Another way to look at it is in a bar graph, and you can see the 10 hottest years ever recorded have all been since 2010. This summer we had the hottest June and hottest July ever recorded, and this summer we had the hottest ocean temperature recorded off the shores of Florida. So this year it looks like it's going to be in the hunt for one of the hottest years as well. And it means that here in the Georgia area, it's getting hotter. Your summers are about 3 degrees hotter on average, and they're extending about 32 days longer than back in 1970. And this is a little wonky, but there's been a lot done recently on creating the science of attribution, which enables scientists to look at an event and see how much climate change impacted it. And one of the things I've come up with is a climate shift index. And what this depicts is the number of days that climate change made heat 3 times more likely or higher in all of these areas. So in other words, in our own parts of Mexico, it made 90 days of heat that was 3 times more likely to be excessive heat because of climate change. Watch this. The science of attribution is coming, and it's coming fast, and I think as journalists it'll be a wonderful tool for you to connect the dots. So what does it mean going forward? Well, it means if we were to continue on our current emissions path, which I really don't believe we will, but if we were, that summers here in the Atlanta area at the end of the century will feel like summers kind of in the middle of Texas. And for some of our hottest cities, like Phoenix, which is roasting this year, it's projected that their temperatures will be much more like cities in Saudi Arabia. And we all know that it's not just heat, but it's the combination of heat and humidity that is so deadly. And when we hit a heat index of 105 degrees, it's dangerous even for young people to be outside because our bodies can no longer, we can sweat, but it doesn't evaporate to cool down our bodies because it's just too wet in the atmosphere. And then our heart works really, really hard to send our blood to the surface to cool us off, and it causes all sorts of problems and can even lead to organ failure. But heat does much more than just that. So let's think about what these cities, some of them are the ones that are the fastest growing cities in the country, what's going to happen when months and months it's going to be dangerous to be outside for a big part of the day. What do we think is going to happen to their jobs and economy? Right? Well, we know that human productivity goes way down as heat goes up. We know that crop yields have thresholds over which they begin to fail, heat thresholds over which they begin to fail. We know they'll have to build more infrastructure to keep their population safe. And we know that infrastructure tends to degrade more quickly in the heat. Roads buckle, railroads twist, airplanes are grounded. And with drought, rivers can dry up and really harm commerce. So clear hits to jobs and economy. What about that second one? health and security. Well, we talked about heat stroke, but heat does a lot more in that arena as well. It causes premature births. It causes increased heart and lung disease. It also exacerbates heart and lung disease. And it also increases levels of suicide and of crime. And what we may not know, that it is the #1 weather killer, more than any other weather event that we experience. And I think part of that is it can be so insidious because you don't know you're at risk until it can be too late. What about that last one, geopolitical instability? Anyone want to guess why this heat and humidity could lead to that? Yes.
Fighting over resources.
Fighting over resources, over food, water, yes.
I was just going to say more specifically water, like water wars.
Water wars are coming. That's a very good point.
People relocating if they can't find the resources they need, and it strains where there's resources available, it constrains the numbers.
People relocating, migrating, and that, all of those are all tied together, right? It's the resources and the fact that those lands are becoming less habitable because Central America and parts of South America are expected to be even hotter. And those areas don't have strong governance and institutions to protect their people. And so they expect migration flows and wars, but migration flows against our borders, unlike anything we've seen before. And intriguingly, they also expect that as we get into the century, more people who live in the South will begin to migrate to the North because the economies will be stronger and the temperatures will be more livable and comfortable. So both outside and inside of our country migration. But heat isn't just in our country, it's all over the world. This is from the World Economic Forum, and they project that if we were to continue on our current emissions path, which again, I do not think we're crazy enough to do, but if we were, 1/3 of the projected world's population will live in areas that will experience Saharan-like summer temperatures during their summer, which is about an average of 104 degrees Fahrenheit during their summer. So to your point, what does that mean if parts of Africa, which is the fastest growing continent population-wide in the world, or India, which is the #1 most populated country in the world, or even Australia, what do you think it means if for so much of the year they are experience that kind of heat? Disruption, migration, battles, right? So this is something also as a journalist to keep your eye on, because sometimes we get so myopic and just look at our country, but some of this story is unfolding even more brightly in other parts of the world. Food. This is from the World Resource Institute, a nonpartisan group, and they took a look at what crop yields could be at a 3 degrees Celsius or a 5.4 degree Fahrenheit increase, which we are definitely on that path right now. And what we see is that we start losing the ability to grow food near our population centers. Some areas in the north, like Sweden, who just started to grow wine, they have vineyards now, will make out better. But the vast majority of areas where we grow our food today near our population centers will see decreases in food production. And this includes the rice bowl over in Asia, our bread basket here in the center of our country, and even our salad bowl and wine cellar over in California. And food isn't just on land, it's also in the oceans. What many people don't realize is when carbon dioxide mixes with ocean water, it turns into carbonic acid. And our oceans are 30% more acidic today than they were at the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that means that creatures that make their shells out of calcium, including oysters and clams that we love to eat, have a very hard time, and their shells are thinning and they are becoming very vulnerable. And this is especially true with these little sea butterflies, which are at the base of the marine food chain for fin fish like mackerel and salmon. We're not just acidifying the ocean is absorbing about 90% of the excess heat, so it's getting hot. In fact, in some areas, it's much as 4 degrees hotter. And that has real implications for our hurricanes. Now, scientists aren't saying that we're necessarily having more hurricanes. There is something going on with wind shears, which can help dissipate some of the smaller ones. But we are seeing more big ones, and we're seeing them change their patterns. So that they can intensify more quickly, they hold more rain when they hit the land, and they're also starting further away from the equator and staying stronger further away from the equator. So again, the jury is out on the full impact there, but also an evolving story that will become clearer as we get into the next decade. The heat and the acidity together causing havoc with our coral reefs. Coral reefs are the nurseries to 24% of marine sea life. So clearly, we are kind of impacting future generations' ability to feed themselves from the sea. Now, this is a really good point to think about those small numbers mattering, because the most recent International Panel on Climate Change report said that if we could keep our temperature increase to that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, we could potentially save up to 30% of our coral reefs. But if we go all the way to the 2-degree one, they think we will lose them all. So it shows that every smidgen of a degree is worth fighting for and has real impact in the natural world and on us. Anyone want to guess where this heavy rainstorm caused this chaos? Well, just this week it was Libya, and last week it was Hong Kong, but it also could be Kentucky or Florida or Washington, D.C. or New York City or Vermont. It could be anywhere because it's happening everywhere. And the reason it's happening is just physics, right? The warmer oceans are allowing more water to evaporate. The warmer air can hold more water vapor. For every degree Celsius increase, it can hold about 7% more water vapor. And that simply means that when conditions are right for a thunderstorm, they're coming more often in this cataclysmic torrential way instead of in restorative showers. And you can see from this graphic that indeed it's happening everywhere more, all across our country, and again, really all across the world. Even in places that are in drought, when they finally get the water, it's coming in a dangerous form more often. And we have to talk about sea level rise. You guys are a coastal state. Globally, the seas have risen about 9 inches since 1990, and that's for 2 reasons. One, glacial ice, the land ice is melting and it's running into the sea. And the second is because the oceans are getting hotter, and that means they're thermally expanding. It's playing havoc now, even on sunny days, because it can create impassable roads and make it very hard, even in downtown business centers, which is hurting commerce, it's hurting the kids' ability to get to school. But it also has real ramifications for costs, because it means that we are being forced to spend a lot more on infrastructure to be able to keep our community safe and usable. This is Highway 80 that takes you out to Tybee Island, and this is a king tide that is compromising that road right now. So you can imagine that if indeed we continue on our path and we get close to 4 feet more, and I've seen some lower numbers too, some 3 depending on the source, but big numbers that can overwhelm our infrastructure that we have. And remember, our infrastructure hugs the coastline, so it's our roads, our bridges, our airports. It's even our fiber optics, which link all of commerce up and down our coastline, which are water resistant but not waterproof. So we have a lot of choices coming about what we can harden and what we're going to have to leave to the sea. And we know that the story was, hey, climate change is going to happen, if it happens at all, to far off people in far off places. It's better to make our economy as strong as possible now so that if and when it comes, future generations can handle it. The new story is climate change is here and now, and as taxpayers, we are on the hook for it. We are paying for these natural disasters. We are paying for this new infrastructure that we have to build because nature is playing by a whole new set of rules. And the cost of moving towards a clean tech future is dropping so precipitously, it makes sense whether you believe in climate change or not. So what do I mean by that? I mean that human ingenuity and know-how has given us an alternative way of powering our economy. And it's going to be a transition that we have to do well. There are going to be hiccups, but there is great hope that indeed we can move to a cleaner economy and still have vibrant economies and vibrant high-level quality of life. So what this chart is showing you, and it's from Lazard, which is a institutional investment expert. And what you see is that wind and solar today are at about $40 to $41 per megawatt hour, and the closest fossil fuel is at 72, is that right? Offshore wind is 72. It's actually at 75, which is coal, and 93 for natural gas on a global basis last year, which means that renewables last year were about 40% cheaper than fossil fuels. And obviously, the fossil fuel arena is very volatile. It could go up, it could go down, but experts predict that these numbers could potentially get half as big by the end of the decade. So these are projected to continue to go down as well. And quite honestly, these are the cheapest utility prices that humankind has ever experienced, even when you put in the inflation through all the years. So it's kind of a game changer. And at the same time, batteries have dropped in price and are expected to come down even more, which enables us the flexibility to use these new types of energy for much greater parts of our electricity grid and even in some other areas. And importantly, it means that these new forms of energy, wind in China, solar in America, solar in India, are the cheapest form of energy for all of the three biggest emitters. China, the US, and India are China's number one, US number two, and India is number three on emissions. So obviously, we have a lot of control over what happens in the future. And the market is responding. This is a graph that shows that 86% of all new power generation added this year is projected to be non-fossil fuel. And that's 90% when you look at it on a global basis. So again, the economics are forcing the market in this direction. And when we hear that, oh gosh, we can't use more renewables, it will make us unreliable, you can't depend on it, the wind doesn't blow all the time, take a look at all the countries who are doing it much better than we are and have vibrant economies and are doing just fine. In fact, we're down here at 22, even China is beating us at 30.6. And this means that we can actually save money in this transition. This is from ERCOT, which is the grid down in Texas. And Texas is a deregulated market, and it is number one in wind, and it is fast becoming, close to being, number one in solar. And I don't know if I said, they get about 40% of their power from renewables. And you can see that in a study done over savings from the integration of renewables, last year it was about $11 billion, which equated to about $500 in every household's pocket that is in ERCOT. Just to make a note on that too, West Virginia, which has not moved, that continues to provide their electricity based on coal, they have one of the highest electricity costs in the country. It's around 61 per kilowatt hour, and it's analyzed if they added more renewables, it could drop down to 49. So that's also a real story that can be done at an individual or household level, what this renewable revolution is bringing for savings instead of as a sacrifice. It's bringing jobs all across the country, as many as 170K jobs, a lot of investment, especially since some of the new incentives that came in on the federal level. And this is also a really important story. It's, again, on the economics of energy. Today, renewables are cheaper than 99% of all coal plants. They are just about cheaper now to build than to build a new gas plant. But it's projected, like around 2030, they're going to be a lot cheaper to run in general with all the clean energy programs that we have than an existing gas plant. So what does that mean when you build a gas plant today that's supposed to last for 40 years, that costs millions and millions of dollars, when in the next 7 years, you could be much more expensive than the alternative, right? So there's a lot of choices we're going to have to make, again, to build for the future instead of for the past. And it's also a recognition that we do need natural gas for the short and midterm in order to balance this transition, to make sure that we do have the energy when we need it. But perhaps it's more as a peaking plan versus as a base load plan, and that changes the economics. So an unfolding story there. And the sense that a lot of experts, this is from the National Academies of Science, but there was also a study out of Princeton University that said that if we repurposed our dollars that are currently going into fossil fuels and repurpose our health costs that are currently being paid because we're burning fossil fuels, we could make the transition to net zero without spending significantly more, really at the same cost. That too is kind of mind-boggling and wasn't believed just 2 or 3 years ago. And this is a sense of how big the health costs are projected to be from cancer, lung disease, heart disease that are associated with burning fossil fuels. And it's about 3.5 trillion over a decade. And we now know that we are growing jobs. And I don't have to tell you that here in Georgia. You are the #1 poster child state of growing jobs and bringing in investment in this clean tech arena. Oops, we already showed that. Okay, other reasons we have hope, because other countries are in the game. It's not just the United States that's making sacrifices, and I personally don't call it a sacrifice to save money and have a cleaner environment. Other countries have made incredibly powerful pledges and are taking actions, cities, states, and companies. And in fact, when you look at everyone who has made a pledge to decrease their emissions, it comes out to be about 90% of global GDP. And if everybody followed through on their promises, it would get us much closer to that 2-degree goal. China is always a big question in the room when we talk about climate change, and that's understandable because they are still building coal at a fast rate. But it's really a story of contradictions, because as much coal as they are building, they are also building 4 times as much renewables. And so they have stated in their long-term planning that they want to be the singular superpower in this new clean tech arena. They have configured their education to get the types of employees and experts that they need to do so, and they are out investing the rest of the world by far. In fact, they spend about 50% of all dollars in renewables and control about 60% of all the manufacturing of the new tech. And it's not because they're good guys. It's A, they see the market potential, but B, they are more at risk to climate change than we are. Their manufacturing and their population centers are on deltas, which are being threatened by sea level rise, and their food center, which is the high China plain, is much more vulnerable to drought and heat than even ours. So they have skin in the game. And again, they are outspending us by about 4 to 1 and by far dominating the world. Lastly, or thirdly, we also know that there's a lot more impetus from businesses. Businesses are literally leading the charge. Back in 2008, they were like, oh, do not give us climate policy, it would make us less competitive. Today, they're like, give us smart climate policy because we need the rules of the road, because climate change is coming for our bottom line, and because our stakeholders, our employees, our consumers, and our shareholders are demanding it. Another reason we have a lot of hope is the new technologies that are coming. It is just so exhilarating to see what is being concocted, and even old ideas that are being repurposed for today's time. We have to upgrade our grid. We know that we have technology that would make it much more efficient right now, and we know that we can build it in a way that incorporates a lot more storage and brings energy from far-flung places so that we can integrate much more of that clean energy into it. And once we have a clean grid, we can electrify so many areas of our lives. How many of you have driven an electric car? Yes. Who thinks it's a sacrifice? Who thinks it's better? Yes, right? It's faster. It's more responsive. You feel like if anyone comes up at you, you can escape, right? It's quieter. It's not polluting your neighborhood, your streets. It's cheaper to own, it's cheaper to maintain, and it's just about to be cheaper to buy as these price points come down. And so it's not a sacrifice, it's actually better. And I think that's going to take a little while for people to get into, but we have always evolved to things that are better, and this better can save the world. So let's do it. This is another thing that is fascinating, that technology is enabling us as homeowners to participate in the energy grid. So what I mean is, if you have an electric car, or if you have an electric battery that stores either utility energy or energy from, say, your solar panels, or even if you have an electric water heater, there is technology out there that would enable the utility to say, hey, on a hot summer day from 5 to 7 when our grid is under duress, I'm going to buy 5% of your energy from your car, from your battery, from your water heater, and I will pay you for that. And then you are part of a virtual battery. You are participating to make that grid more stable, and you're benefiting from it because you don't need the energy at that time. Another thing that's fascinating is that we're coming up with ways of capturing the carbon and keeping it from getting into the atmosphere where it creates havoc. This is a plant in Iceland where they pump gas underneath basalt rock, and it turns back into rock where it will be captured for thousands of years. And this is so exciting. It's negative emissions technology. It's a huge vacuum cleaner that sucks the carbon out of the air and then sells it for useful products. So this is actually in Switzerland, and it sells its carbon that it captures to a Coca-Cola factory to put fizz and seltzers and sodas. How about that? And there are other companies that are taking emissions and turning it back into fuel. And that means if we burn that fuel, it becomes emissions, and we take it out again, and then we burn it, and we take it out again. That becomes a circular thing. That means we aren't putting up more emissions. And there's even a company up in Brooklyn that makes vodka out of emissions. A very useful idea. Fusion. Who knows about fusion? Okay, what do you think? Possible? Impossible? Hopeful? Out of reach? Anybody? Okay, it's always been said to be out of reach. But we think that the Department of Energy thinks that it is finally coming in with reach. This is considered the holy grail of energy. It is the power of the sun. It's how the sun makes all of the energy that we benefit from. And we've had such breakthroughs in AI and in lasers and magnets that it is finally becoming feasible. And in fact, the Department of Energy believes that we could have fusion on the grid as early as the mid-2040s. And there is a lot of private capital that is pushing ahead. And there are a lot of countries that are competing to be at the forefront. Nuclear. This is called miniature nuclear. This is the little human being, so it's not quite so miniature. But these new modular nuclear plants hold a lot of hope. Many of them are built in a way that they shut off by natural causes instead of needing human intervention if something goes awry. Some of them use molten salt instead of water. Some of them use thorium instead of uranium. And they're built modularly, which keeps the cost down and gives you better quality control. And the idea is that some of these potentially could slide into a defunct coal plant attached to the grid, giving out energy and bringing jobs back into those communities. Keep your eye on this. This is coming. It's coming in other countries as well, but the United States is embracing it too. Green hydrogen. If fusion is the holy grail, this is the Swiss Army knife of new energy. We make green hydrogen by taking water, green energy, splitting the hydrogen atoms off, and those atoms can be used a lot like natural gas. They can be used in long-distance transportation. It can be used in manufacturing. It can be turned into a liquid called ammonia, which really allows you to store clean energy for a later time. It is projected this could be as much as 15% of our energy mix in the next, don't quote me on this, but it's something like in the next 2 decades. So again, there's a huge competition amongst countries to see who can get at the forefront of green hydrogen. And then we have the power of nature. We shouldn't count her out. If we start playing by her rules instead of forcing her to play by ours, there's great hope. Sustainable agriculture, restorative soil practices could help us absorb as much as 30% of the excess carbon in the air, and there is real momentum to do this. And we also know that just providing a recognition of the economic value of our natural spaces and the fact that they store carbon has to be considered as we move forward in development and what we decide to keep natural. Whether it's the rainforest or our kelp forests or our peatlands, all of them have both ecological value, and economic value. And again, the market hasn't quite learned to price that in, but it's coming. And we know that we have lots of different strategies to solve this or meet this or mitigate this, because it's hard to solve, but mitigate. There are those that are more conservative, those that are more liberal. It's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we haven't had the political will or the social mandate to do it. And that's where all of us come into play. So we are currently still on this red line. We were going up, as I said, somewhere between 5 and 7 if we were to continue on our current path. 7 degrees colder, we were in an ice age, right? Glacial period, lots of ice. Was the world very habitable? No. So what do we think the world could be like at the end of the century if it could be that much hotter? We don't want to go there. Nobody wants to go there. So what we need to do is bring this line down. And luckily, there are pledges from countries that bring us very close to the brown line. When you add in all of the net zero and the countries' promises, we get down closer to the red line. And what that means is we have to hold their feet to the fire. We have to make sure they do what they promise, and we have to continue to innovate to get ourselves down to the green line. And if we do, we will have a very different future. This shows us what is projected if we were going to continue on our current emissions path by each generation and the amount of increased heat they could feel. And you can see that those born in 2013, the Gen Alpha generation, could feel temperatures as much as 7 degrees hotter. But if we make the cuts, they would be only around 2 to 2.5. A very different world ahead. And truly, it's in our hands. And because of time, I'm going to skip over here so we have some questions. These are kind of what we can do, and I can bring those up with Ramsey afterwards. But what I want to close with and say, hey, we are the first generations to understand this issue. We are the first generations to understand what it means for future generations. And we are the first generation to actually have the tools to do something about it. So the question for all of us in this room is, what will we choose to do? Thank you, guys. I look forward to your questions.
It's 11:10 for those of you who have classes to get to. For my class, I'm going to let Kathleen take 5 more minutes of questions, and then we're going to go back to our regular classroom for the second hour.
Okay. And if anybody has a second, there's a 5-question survey that you can take with your phone later, but just take the QR code and let us know what we can do.
Also, there is a newsletter that Sea Change Conversations puts out every month. It's outstanding. It gives you what's going on nationwide and internationally. And in addition to that, your own Professor Ramsey Nix does a local state and Athens update. So if you'd like to get on that mailing list, I encourage you to sign, put your name and email. I'll leave it right here, okay? Thanks.
All right, do y'all have any questions for Kathleen about how we as communicators, both PR practitioners and journalists, can take this information and make stories? Any questions?
Yes.
How do we keep politicians accountable?
Tell them you're watching. So there's actually, it's really fascinating to me because in some of our other presentations, we go through how we got so polarized. And there's reason for it. And if you want to say after, I'll walk you through it. But it's shifting. And so a couple of things that are happening. Right now, the words climate change are radioactive. But if you get underneath those words to, do you support clean energy? Do you support taxing taxing carbon as a pollution? Do you support electric vehicles? If you go into all of those, there's actually much stronger support across the board. In addition, the conservative Congress people are looking to pivot on this. The Conservative Climate Caucus is one of the fastest growing and is now the second largest, I think, caucus in the House. And it's not that they're coming out with really breakthrough solutions, but they're talking about it. And it gave them a safe space to talk about it. And when they first started it, they thought there was going to be a handful, and they had so many people come. They and they could come without using their real name, so nobody would know. And then so many people came, they had to turn people away. So they were surprised that they were looking. And I think part of that reason is because companies, big companies, some of the smaller companies are still against action because they're worried about the cost of the regulations, right? And if you're a small company, it could really harm you. But the big ones, especially multinationals, are being forced to do it because of international pressures anyway. But companies are changing. There's also a sense now that this clean tech means economic development. So if you divorce it from the words climate change, it can have great support. It's bringing jobs, it's bringing investment. And then the fact is the younger generation, conservative or liberal, care deeply about this issue. And they are a bigger voting bloc than the oldest generation, which is the group that is most intractable about this. So the reality of the politics are changing. The power of the emotion of the words, and I'm against it if you're for it, is exploding. And part of it is pundits, and part of it is what we're reading in journalism. So it is a burden. I think I was a journalist too, but it is a burden about what our industry can do great good, but it can also lead to great dissension. So, but if you get underneath that vehemence and get to things that don't have the word climate change on them, there's a lot more support. And I think the more they hear from their constituents, because you got to remember that this was kind of a taboo topic to talk about even 2 or 3 years ago. It's the more they hear, the more that people raise their voices, come to events, see change events. We had we had a state senator, we had city council people, we had board of education people. Get the word out, and then once you see, it's hard to unsee, right? It's hard. Okay, any other questions? Oh, come on, guys, you're journalists, yes.
Do you have any insight on investigative journalism with companies that are greenwashing?
I wish I did. Honestly, I don't. It is a big problem. What I do think is there are a lot more watchdog groups that are coming forward, providing pretty strong analysis. I think journalism has a critically important role to play there. I think that it's greenwashing is a really big deal because we have to have metrics. We have to have a transparent way to evaluate a company, and they have to have a way to know that they are making progress. And if both the right and the left don't believe them, then we're in a quagmire. I think the metrics are getting stronger. I just was reading about what California did I think this week about going in front of the SEC and mandating full transparency, including the impacts on scope 3, remember, which is the one that everybody's fighting, which is the end user and your consumers and using your product. So I can't answer that specifically except to say it's incredibly important, and the entire topic is incredibly important to enable this huge shift amongst industry and companies to feel like it's a fair road. And that's why you also need good policy, because you need to set the rules of the road. So that was a mediocre answer, I'm sorry. Yes?
How do we continue conversations about climate change and environmental activism when the people we're talking to become hostile and defensive, especially when showing statistics and using sort of hot button terms like China's efforts towards green energy? How do we continue these conversations and about that?
Well, that's a good one. The way we do it at Sea Change Conversations is delicately. We go in and we say, hey, we're nonpartisan, we're science, and we go into where they're comfortable, so we don't force them to come to us. We talk about the things that they care about and acknowledge that fossil fuels have been incredible friends to us. They've given us this vibrant economy. We don't bash them. We recognize that fossil fuels could have an important role in the transition if we could get them to actually do more than they are currently doing, even though they say they're only spending about 4% of their budget. So they put all these commercials out and they're really not doing much. We also show them the economic story. And I think that is, the reason we had such antagonism towards climate action really started because of the economics. In 2008, when they were pushing climate policy, green energy was a lot more expensive. China was using coal up the gazoo. It would have meant, if we had pivoted at that moment, that our companies and many of our states who depended on fossil fuels would have been really harmed because manufacturing costs would have gone up. Everything from toothpaste to tomato sauce to toilet paper. Everything is made with energy, and so it would have been more expensive. Today, that's not the case anymore. In fact, long term, once you make that investment, companies can actually save money. So down in Florida, there was a great happening where the Tea Party and the environmental groups got together to create the Green Tea Party. They were promoting solar on homes, distributed solar. One was doing it for climate reasons. One was doing it for economic reasons. But they actually forced through changes in the policy in that state. So economics is really the bottom line. And the argument that China is getting away with murder is the opposite. We are being left in the dust because they are owning the future by the investment and the industrial policy they have set into motion. So the competition is no longer, oh, they get to use coal. It's like, holy moly, Batman, we are way behind in this race, and that's where the future is going. So what I've heard, we've talked about 400, 500 people over the last couple of days. What I heard is, one, knowing that we can literally measure the molecules in the air that come from us, proving that it's us was really important. Two, the fact that China is beating us is incredibly important. Those were two conservatives that came up and said those were the slides that most impacted them. And I'm happy to share slides, guys, and I'm happy to share facts. And the newsletter, and Ramsey does such a great job with her portion of the newsletter. So I do hope you'll sign up for that.
Kathleen has gotten a great handout for us, which I'll share with you about, with all of her resources for covering climate. So, and obviously climate touches on all of the beats that we're going to be covering this semester. Definitely touches on sustainability, but all of the other beats as well. So I'll share that with you.
Yay.
Thank you
Good.
so
Thank you,
much.
guys, and good luck.